All right, guys. This is gonna be a quick one, and then we'll probably do the video today. Um, Overall, I guess you could say it was more of a positivo day. Uh, Disney went buck wild. For people who have been waiting for Disney
Sorry about that. I was doing something.
has arrived. Um, and Disney has just gone cray cray. So, we talked about this earlier. It picked a day. Not only did it say, "Hey, we're gonna go over $100," it just went. So this must have had. Oh yeah, this all happened. It had a good day and it had hit over 100, and then all of a sudden, it says the high was 99.
They had good earnings.
This is clearly over 100, so I don't get this. That doesn't make sense to me. So today,
No, it did. It got into 99.28, and then in the post market, it was above 100.
but what is this wick right here?
Huh?
What is this wick? This shows over $100 to me.
Oh, you're right.
So I
Sometimes
don't know.
that thing is wrong
Why do you say that?
because you're right. It says it hit 100, the high.
Yeah, I don't know what this is. Maybe it's a dot, a mistake, or whatever. But um, this doesn't make sense to me. 99. I don't know what it is. But anyway, um, in the aftermarket, it did this. Not sure why this is so grand. I don't know what this means. Obviously, it made money. Earnings were good.
Yes,
Uh,
earnings were good. They're gonna give out a dividend, and that's what spiked it up like no tomorrow.
okay, then that will do it for you. So, yeah.
And also on top of that, they have done a deal with the Fortnite company.
Okay.
So it was double whammy. So that's why it went cray cray like that.
Okay, then that will do it for you because it sure doesn't explain anything just with earnings. Ford did well. I don't think Ford had earnings. It had it the day before, which it did very good, and so because of that, the price, the overcharging of manufacturer pricing for vehicles, has helped Ford make a lot of money. Um, Coin is finally starting to come back. We know where Coin has been, guys. Meta, it was still positivo in this terrible, terrible day. I'm still in this caca, and yeah, we'll see what happens. Softies positive, but Softy has been slow going. It didn't jump up like Meta and other things. So a lot of stuff was positive today. I'm not gonna go through each one because it's gonna be quick. Um, Ruku shut up like cray cray at least. Um,
No commentarial.
you still in it, right? You got, you never got it back out, right?
That's
Dix,
correct.
um, Dix is still doing very well. So if you like it, hey, um, you 27 days you have. Mickey D's, I know they took like a downturn. There was talk about, you probably heard this, Elisa, something about like they didn't do so well. People were talking about the revenue, but I thought they did well for their earnings. They met that, so I don't see why people would be talking caca unless they just want to take profit, because this is a right around where it was at before when it got to all-time highs. This little same area here looks like it's new 52-week, slightly above what it was previously. But if people want to take their money and bring it back down here, that's bring it back down to what it says 250. That's fine. But I don't see anything related to earnings that McDonald's, you know, they've come out bad for. So I don't know why people are talking trash. Nikete, aka Nike, it came up, um, it got up to 104. I could have waited, but I didn't. Um, Next week it'll be at my price. Uh, Maybe the end of this week. Amazon. Um, this was the other one that did somewhat. Um, this was with Softy, where it didn't initially go crazy. No, it did. No, this one was with Meta. Uh, where it didn't initially go crazy, but then it went crazy. Uh, Google, that was with Softy. It took its time coming up. Uh, Bank of America, all of these were somewhat positive today. Um, Apple was the last one. Uh, Not too many swings in Apple though. Yeah, maybe $2.50. So now we're getting to negative ones. Uh, we talked about XOM previously. We've been talking about that for a while now. We know that 115 level is where we want to short, see if it comes up there. We're thinking that it will come back down, and our level was basically down to that, right above the 80 level. So, yeah, I like it above 100, but because there was some type of upgrade, and 115 was the number they used, so I'm using that number too. American, I want to wait on this just because I want to see what happens with Boeing first. Walmart, EBC. We're gonna wait on EBC, get it between 11 and 12. They are transferring their shares with what's that, Cambridge Court Bank, their merger. Um, so they're gonna be the largest, I think. It's either largest bank in Massachusetts or New England. I think it's Massachusetts. Um, but it's probably one and the same. Anyway, um, but I think it was specified as Massachusetts specifically. Um, Maybe Connecticut or something. P time. I This has come up a little bit. Um,
Just wait until
I
it gets back to five.
Yeah,
Five,
if you
five
want
or
to
above.
start nibbling and buying in now, that's fine. But um, just try to see if your average price can be between 5 and 6. This could get up that number. It's really between 6 and 7. So that's the best spot to get it at. We know about Macy's. Um, I think it's heading down. Right for a short. Campbell's is at a good price if people want to buy in. Um, we've been telling you about this. It's come down significantly. It was at 45, um, and now it's 43 and change. So here's your chance. Open. that too popped up a little bit. So if you want to try to get back in, when it goes back down again, you can do that. But those were the losers of the day. So now I'm going to show you the video that I had been wanting to show. Not sure what I have for time here. So what is this? No, it's not this one. It's like okay. Recently I stopped video.
Why are you not investing in tech?
Okay, so when we were looking at okay, the rent one.
It's no secret that rent is getting harder and harder to afford in this country. But according to a new report from Harvard, the affordability crisis has reached an all-time high, and it's hitting people across the income spectrum. For more, I'm joined by Chris Herbert, Managing Director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, the group behind the report, and Lizzie Wyant, Deputy Executive Director for the Metropolitan Area Planning. Thank you both so much for being here. So housing is, you know, this is a national report, but it's ultimately a very local issue. Can you talk about how the findings in this report, Chris, compare to the region of New England or Massachusetts?
Sure, and thanks for having us. You know, in many respects, what's happening here in Boston is very much a reflection of what's happening nationally. We've seen rents going through the roof, and we've seen the number of renters who are struggling to pay their rent reaching record highs. The difference in Boston is that we are an economically strong region. So if we compare Boston to the rest of the country, our rents are much higher than they are in other parts of the country. We document the fact that the nation has lost a lot of rental units renting for less than $1,000 over the last decade. In Boston, we lost those a long time ago. So in Boston, what's happening is the shift in rents is happening at a much higher level. We're losing rentals under $1,400 in Boston. And so it's the same problem, but it's just all shifted over to a higher end of the market. But in both cases, in the nation and in Boston, it's people across the income spectrum who are really struggling to be able to afford rent.
Well, that was a really interesting part of this report that I wanted to ask you about. Lizzie, did you want to say something? Okay, I'm sorry. Just as of 2022, your research found that nearly 1 in 4 renters were severely overburdened by the cost of housing. So they're spending at least half of their income every month on housing. That's up from 15% back in 2001. You mentioned that here in Massachusetts and in Boston, you know, people are making more money. I'm wondering how the report kind of, it shows a record number of households being cost burdened, but rent growth is flat, meaning that people, you know, it kind of cooled off after this big bump in 2022, and people are having a more difficult time affording their rent, but rent itself is not necessarily skyrocketing, right? So is it that people are just are they making more money or just unable to afford rent? Like, how does this report square with the fact that people can't pay their rent, but rent isn't necessarily as high maybe as it was during this huge boom?
Sure. 2 things to take note of. One is that, you know, we're relying on big national surveys that come out with a lag. So our measure of how many people are facing unaffordable rents is from 2022. So there's a little bit of a lag there. And so you're right. When we report on what's happening most recently with rent trends, we find is that rents that were growing at double digits are now down to about 0. In Boston, I think they're growing at about 3%. You know, that sounds like a good story, but when you say that rents went to the highest levels they've ever been, and now they're not growing anymore, this means the problem's not getting worse. It doesn't mean that you can now suddenly find an apartment that's affordable. It is the case that if incomes are going up faster than that, you know, 2 or 3% of rents, that there will be some progress made in gaining ground on affordability, but we've lost so much ground that just growing at 0% or not growing at all is going to take a long time for people to get back where they were just a few years ago.
Lizzie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how we got here, right? So I think housing has now become, in recent years, a huge issue, right? It's definitely a part of the mainstream. It's part of every political campaign. It has to be addressed. We're in a housing crisis everywhere, as we see from the report. How did we get here, and what are the solutions that are being proposed?
I think there's probably three main things that contributed to how we got here. I think it's the fact that we've had insufficient funding to meet all of our housing needs. We have incredibly restrictive zoning in Massachusetts, and it's all those decisions are made at the local level. And we just don't have enough affordable housing or affordability overall. And all of those things contribute to the fact that we have not been able to meet our housing targets or to produce nearly enough housing to meet demand.
Right. We saw in the report, in just a couple of years ago, we had this big boom of multifamily building construction. That slowed as well. But even then, most of that wasn't affordable, right?
Yeah, I think primarily what we're seeing are builders building at the upper end of the market, which is typically what builders will do, which is not a bad thing, right? If we build a lot of high-end rental housing, that means is that people will move out of their current apartment, move into that high-end rental housing, and vacate some other housing and lowering price points. It's called filtering. So we build a lot of housing at the top, and then that adds to supply and ultimately keeps rent pressures down across the board. But in order for filtering to work is you have to build enough housing so that you have an excess of housing that allows for that filtering process to happen. And to Lizzie's point, we just haven't been building enough. As much as we're building a lot of apartments, the demand for apartments from millennials moving back into the cities over the last decade has been astounding. And so we haven't been building enough to keep up demand. That filtering process hasn't had a chance to work. And so rents are getting pushed up across the board instead of falling. I think to your point earlier, now we are starting to see that supply catch up with demand. Rents have started to have leveled off at zero, which in the long run, that's what we need to do to get the market back into equilibrium. But we don't live in the long run, we live in today. And so what do we do now about trying to help sure that people can find a house that they can afford?
Well, what do we do now? Because I think you're mentioning this kind of, I don't want to say trickle down economics. Obviously that's loaded, but that's kind of what it sounds like, right? Is that, if you build enough of these luxury condos, then eventually everything will become affordable. But when you have these government restrictions, as Lizzie mentioned, zoning laws and all these other sort of political things that slow the process down, what would incentivize me as somebody who, is going to put up an apartment building to make a percentage of that affordable or to create an affordable apartment building? Why would I choose to do that if it's going to be more costly and take more time and use different, more material? Like, why it's going to be a huge slog? What's going to incentivize me to do that?
Well, I think that's why we need some of the policies that are in the Housing Act that the governor proposed. We call it the Housing Bond Bill, the Affordable Homes Act, alongside some of the budget proposals that she also included in her most recent budget. There needs to be funding priorities to make sure that we are also providing stability, particularly for our lowest income residents across the Commonwealth. So we have to create some tenant protections because housing production doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades to get there, and we've been underperforming for years. So we can't, and nobody can live in a housing zone, right? People actually live in homes and in housing units. And so it takes a while to get there. So we have to put some protections in place on the policy side and on the funding side to protect low-income residents, whether they're renters or owners. And then you actually have to create incentives to get to the kind of production that we need. So in addition to, the luxury housing that Chris was talking about, we're facing this situation in Massachusetts in particular, where we're going to see a really large increase over the next 10, 20 years of households that are run by people over the age of 65 who can't afford to move. They can't afford to move out of their home into a home in their neighborhood or community where they can afford to stay and grow old. And so we have to think about the type of that we're also building and creating some of those policy incentives so that developers actually want to build all the housing types to meet the housing need.
Right. It's not just about building more multifamily housing or building more affordable housing. I think in the report it said that that population is aging and the materials, the houses themselves are also aging, right? In public housing, there's an estimated material backlog of maintenance fees, right, of some $90 billion across the country. So we've got these houses that are getting old. We've got people living in houses that are getting a little older. What does that result in if we don't intervene?
Well, I think we talk a lot about new construction, but I think what this brings up is the fact that we have a lot of existing housing that needs to be retrofitted to be suitable for the population we have. And so if we're going to talk about aging, we have to talk about housing that's accessible. So we need to make sure that folks who get to a stage of life where they have mobility issues can get around. So there's things like no step entry, but making sure that levers are in the door so you can, with arthritis, you can still open the door, making sure that switches and the like are within reach if you happen to be in a wheelchair for some period of time. So there's ways in which we can invest in the existing housing stock to make it more suitable for people as they age, as well as adding new housing that's well located and can meet those needs.
Lizzie, some of this report shows growth in areas that are more affordable, sprawl. I wanted to talk about some of the other impacts, right, of this kind of planning or lack of planning, right? You see these huge racial gaps, wealth gaps, racial gaps in home ownership. There's huge disparities there. There's also people moving into areas that are more affordable, and that has a climate impact as well, right? There's an environmental impact on sprawl, as a result of sprawl.
A huge environmental impact as a result of sprawl. I mean, I started my career in advocacy focusing on transportation, and transportation issues and housing issues are really the same. If you can't afford to live close to your job, you have to move far away. And that usually means you need a car and your greenhouse gas emissions are going up. There are some really good policies out there and funding incentives to actually decarbonize housing, which is something that we have to do because the built environment really contributes to increased GHG emissions. And in fact, in Governor Healey's housing bond bill, she actually proposes dollars to decarbonize housing. And that is actually a really important part of this conversation.
It's kind of heartbreaking, too, because this report shows that homelessness has reached an all-time high across the country. And that data is always a little dubious because it's probably much higher than we can actually calculate. But that is, I guess it seems, the result of this lack of planning, right? When you've got people who are forced into homelessness and then eventually end up having to rely on other government resources. So maybe it's a planning ahead kind of thing to prevent that in the future.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty well documented that the rate of homelessness is actually strongly correlated with the level of rents. And if you think about it, if you're someone who's facing some sort of hardship in life, you lost your job, you got sick, you get divorced, these things happen, suddenly you can't pay the rent. If rents are low enough, you can find an affordable rental. If the rents are low enough, you can find a friend who's got a spare bedroom. As the rents go up and up and up, there's no slack in the system. So what we weren't surprised to see that with rents at these historically high levels across the country, the incidence of homelessness has gone up. We're often focused on the problem today of how do we help those folks get back into a house, which is critically important. But we can't lose sight of the fact that if we don't have enough housing to begin with, that's why the problem's getting worse. And so I want to go back to your earlier point. I don't want to be left on the record as saying that I'm only for building luxury housing. I think we do have to build housing across the spectrum. I just want to give a shout out to the MBTA housing choice law, which is, again, to your point about sprawl, is incentivizing or requiring that communities served by the T have housing that's of a denser variety. It's only 15 units per acre. It's not skyscrapers, but it's located within a half mile of transit across the Boston metropolitan area. And that would add a lot of so-called missing middle housing, smaller scale, multifamily housing, transit oriented, could be the kind of housing that's suitable for people as they age. But if we don't address this broader housing supply issue, bring down the overall inflation and rents, add housing across the spectrum, we're going to see affordability continue to get worse, and we're going to see homelessness continue to rise.
Chris Herbert and Lizzie Wyatt. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. One last thing.
I think also that, to Chris's earlier point, that if there aren't enough available units, it is much harder for somebody who is facing homelessness to find a unit that they can afford themselves. And we have to build all across the spectrum. We can't just zone for it. We really have to build across the spectrum, and communities need the tools to be able to do that as easily as possible.
Great. Chris Herbert and Lizzie Wyant, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So you think you know Wix, but do you really? First up, we've got Shake Video.
So that's that, Lisa.
$33.1 trillion. That's how much Americans have saved up for retirement as of September.
Miss Munoz.
Sorry, I apologize. Espérate,
So
venga a decirle algo a Filiana, espérate. Yes.
that's that. It was a bunch
I
of
don't want-
stuff. I don't know if I agree with everything they talked about.
Yes.
But basically, um, just because the pricing of housing is not going up ridiculously every year doesn't mean people still can afford it. It has a lot to do with our laws. It has a lot to do with towns not allowing buildings, uh, 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 apartments to be built. It has a lot to do with um, towns uh, approving only McMansions by builders instead of starter housing at 1,000 square feet. Has a lot to do with all of that.
I agree. I agree with that.
And then people will say, "Oh yeah, well, it's no housing. Why did we build 4,000 square foot homes on 1 acre lots instead of building 10,000 square foot homes so that people could buy a house for 200,000? You know, if you
Correct.
build these little starter homes, you can make money. You can sell the house for $100,000 and still make money off of it. But that would be too easy, and that will solve the problem too efficiently. So anyway, that's all for today.
Someone
And
has something to tell you after you click the but it has to be out of the recording.
okay, so just call me.
Can you, because somebody wants to see you to tell you.
I'll hold. So stop the recording.